the old East End was, of course, another world, a world that's gone, and an amazing world, a world of friendship. People didn't have a great deal materially, but they had an awful lot of richness in life. There was a wonderful family feel. A lot of people lived close to each other. They didn't have to take buses very often, they walked. The families certainly in my part of the East End, and I think it's fair to say there were different East Ends. I know some people who had a wretched life there, but we had a very rich family life. My father and mother were each one of 8 or 9 brothers and sisters. And so we had a big gathering every Saturday, every Sunday, with masses of cousins, and we had a very rich life. People were very, very close together. People helped each other. In my house, we had one of the 2 up, 2 down, and 2 down below. In other words, we had cellars, kitchens, and other rooms down below, next to the coal cellar, which was typical of those kind of houses along the way there. There were not a lot of people saying with formal invitations. We were in and out of each other's houses all the time. I remember a friend of mine, I was about 9 or 10, his father always seemed to be asleep until I discovered that he was a baker and up all night and slept all day. We had enormous fun. We were, as kids, we were wild, wild kids of the streets. Heaven knows we'd all be in custody or in courts today. And we wandered about the streets as little groups, young boys, young girls. If we wanted to go a little further afield, we walked down to Tower Bridge, as you probably heard from others, and we went onto the sands, which were deposited at the foot of Tower Bridge, and we played. That was our seaside. And we wandered all over the place and all over the East End, and we knew it like the back of our hand. And the big thing was that there was never any, as far as I know, danger to children, as there is today. The children were all pretty safe. We were a group of, say, about half a dozen kids, and we had special calls. So we called to each other. There was no violence at all from these little groups of children. And of course, it was an intensely Jewish life. In my house, my father was a waistcoat tailor. So on the first floor front was the workshop, and the first floor back was where I slept. And I went to bed at night to the tune of the Singer sewing machine and woke up in the morning to the tune of the Singer sewing machine. I think what was lovely about that kind of life, for me as a child with no responsibilities, must have been tough on the older people, was the way we gathered together, the way we reacted to each other, the way we celebrated festivals. Being an intensely Jewish life, of course, I went to normal day school till 4 o'clock, and then a couple of hours every night, almost every night, to Ghetto in Redmond's Road, Talmud Torah, and you probably heard this from others. And so we had a very intense Jewish upbringing. At the Talmud Torah, we were in a class where, for a time, we weren't allowed to talk English. We had to try and talk Hebrew. And I can guarantee you there were long silences as a result. And so it was very intensely Jewish life. I remember opposite Redmond's Road, Talmud Torah, was the casino, one of the two main places in which weddings were held. And as it was run by a part of my extended family, whenever I came out of the cheder, I used to go in and have a meal at the particular wedding that was going on. It's quite extraordinary behaviour. And we lived in Dempsey Street, the same street. Our name was Rosenberg, incidentally. And we lived, which my father shortened to Rose during the war, and we lived in Dempsey Street, the same street in which Isaac Rosenberg lived, a famous poet. And I am convinced from his appearance and appearance of some of my uncles that there was some relationship. But what a gifted man that was. What tragic end at such an early age. Next door to me lived the Pullman family, wonderful family of about 10 children, 9 or 10 children. And I was caught up with that family, and if they washed any of the children, they washed me too. And that was quite an amazing family, and most of them went off to Israel eventually, including Moshe Pullman, who was Ben Gurion's right-hand man during the War of Independence. The area was full of synagogues, not merely synagogues like the very elegant congregation of Jacob's, Elders of Jacob Synagogue in Commercial Road, which part of my family were connected with, but also the Jubilee Street Zionist Great Synagogue. That was its name, Zionist Great Synagogue. And I was there every Friday night and every Saturday morning till I pretty well knew the services by heart as a youngster. And of course, we kids, we were delighted with the way the Shammers there used to give us wine, but he used to hold the back of our head to see we didn't drink too much on Friday nights. It was a rich kind of life. And I remember post-war, in fact, when I was active in the Board of Deputies, after the war had so destroyed parts of the synagogue, that Lord Fisher, Sammy Fisher, and I went back to Jubilee Street Synagogue and turned it into a Talmud Torah for such Jews as were living in the East End. Now, I would say the Jewish community of the East End was primarily a community defined by religion. There were political elements, as described by people like Bill Fishman and so forth, but I always saw the East End not so much as a political gathering of people, but people who were hardworking, had a tough time, craftsmen, shoemakers, furriers, tailors, working very, very hard, and on the whole following patterns of traditional religion. There were numerous synagogues, and when it came to Purim or Hanukkah, we kids wandered from synagogue to synagogue, acquiring a vast stock of sweets and chocolates so that we could almost set up as wholesalers. We had so much, and that was intriguing. And the pattern of politics increased in the 1930s with the rise of the Nazis in Germany and the Mosleyites in London. And I very often saw these gatherings stirring up trouble against the Jewish people by these British Union and fascists. And I remember in 1936, the Cable Street Battle, and I was there at the time, and I stood as a little boy in the front part of a shop where all the glass had been smashed, and I watched as these people and these groups went from end to end and surged this way and that way with the "they shall not pass" and that pattern. It may be that experience induced me to take part in Jewish communal life, so that later on I became the senior vice president of the Board of Deputies, and for a period chairman of Jewish Defence in this country. Jewish Defence was the committee of the Board of Deputies which dealt with the defence of the whole of the Jewish community in Britain and the fight against anti-Semitism. And I had wonderful people like Dr. Jack Gewurz and Izzy Sonnen and others working for me in the board. That defence committee eventually evolved into the current defence mechanism within the Jewish community, the security organisation which now exists. But the impact on me, and probably on so many others at the time, of the naked anti-Semitism and racism, and it probably pushed me into the field of community relations in which I was subsequently involved. So one thing that I always impressed me, we were there, Jewish people, with a number of non-Jewish people around us. A lot of the non-Jewish people had a class consciousness. They felt they generally of the working class. And I never felt, still don't feel, I've never felt that the Jewish people had that kind of class consciousness. The only division in the community was a division as to obviously there was wealthy and non-wealthy, but the main division was as to learning. A person who was learned, like Bronowski, or various people who emerged out of the East End in academic world, those were the people we respected and looked up to. But there was hardly any class consciousness within the Jewish community, and people mixed together very well indeed.